Have you ever watched a room full of experts fail while the quietest man in the building already knew the answer? The glass conference room on the 32nd floor of Whitmore Global overlooked most of downtown Chicago, a skyline of steel and sunlight stretching for miles beyond the river. But inside that room the atmosphere felt smaller than a storage closet. 14 interpreters sat around the long walnut table, headsets on, laptops open, voices overlapping in careful, professional tones that were supposed to carry meaning across continents. Instead, every sentence seemed to land wrong. The representatives from Stockholm leaned back in their chairs, exchanging glances that were growing sharper by the minute. A German consultant pinched the bridge of his nose. A lawyer whispered something under his breath that no one bothered translating. And at the center of it all stood Claire Whitmore, the CEO whose name was printed in silver letters on the building outside, watching a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars slowly unravel. "That's not what we agreed to," one of the Swedish executives said, his English calm but edged with frustration. The interpreter beside him tried to correct the phrasing, but by then the damage had already been done. Another translator stepped in. Then another. Words bounced around the table like loose marbles. Clarifications turned into contradictions. Explanations somehow made things worse. The room grew warmer. Coffee went cold. Someone checked their watch. Across the hall, outside the glass walls where the corporate storm was unfolding, Elijah Brooks was replacing the liner in a stainless steel trash bin. His janitor's cart stood quietly beside him, stocked with disinfectant wipes, paper towels, and a yellow mop bucket that squeaked slightly whenever it rolled across the polished floor. Elijah moved slowly, carefully, the way people learn to move when their job is to stay invisible. But invisible didn't mean unaware. Through the half-closed door, he could hear the fragments of conversation spilling out, English layered with Swedish, German, and a trace of Danish that most people would never notice. Elijah paused for just a second. Not long enough for anyone to think he was eavesdropping. Just long enough to hear the sentence that made his brow tighten slightly. The interpreter had translated a phrase about mutual flexibility, but the original speaker had used a term that meant something closer to conditional obligation. In international business language, that difference wasn't small. It was the difference between a partnership and a trap. Inside the room, a chair scraped back. "If this is the position your company is taking," the Swedish executive said slowly, "then there may be no point continuing this discussion." Claire Whitmore didn't respond immediately. She stood perfectly still at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood, her expression calm but unreadable. Outside, Elijah tied off the trash bag and lifted it from the bin. He could feel the conversation tilting toward collapse the way a driver feels a car drifting on black ice. 14 interpreters had tried to steady it. 14 had failed. Elijah started to roll his cart forward again, then stopped. Just for a moment. Because sometimes the hardest part of knowing something is deciding whether you're allowed to say it. The silence in the conference room did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, the way pressure shifts before a storm. Claire Whitmore finally straightened from the table and looked toward the interpreters seated along the glass wall. 14 professionals. 14 headsets. 14 attempts that had somehow made the conversation worse instead of better. One of the lawyers quietly closed his folder. The Swedish executive across the table leaned back and folded his arms. "Perhaps we should pause this meeting," he said carefully, as though he was trying not to embarrass anyone in the room. Claire nodded once, but did not answer immediately. She was calculating. Everyone in the room could see it. Deals at this level were never just about numbers. They were about trust, tone, and the small cultural signals hidden inside language. Lose the meaning and you lost the agreement. Outside the door, Elijah Brooks gripped the handle of his janitor cart a little tighter than before. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and polished marble. He told himself to keep moving. That was the rule. You do your job. You stay out of the way. You do not step into conversations that belong to people wearing suits that cost more than your monthly rent. But the words drifting through the doorway would not let him ignore them. The interpreter had repeated the same mistranslation again, turning a cooperative proposal into something that sounded almost like a demand. Elijah let out a slow breath through his nose. Inside the room, a new interpreter leaned forward quickly. "Allow me to clarify," the woman said, switching languages mid-sentence with practiced confidence. For a moment, the Swedish executive listened. Then his expression hardened. "No," he said quietly. "That is still incorrect." Chairs shifted again. Someone coughed. A pen tapped against the table. The deal was slipping away one sentence at a time. Elijah felt the weight of the trash bag in his hand and glanced through the glass wall. Claire Whitmore stood near the head of the table now, arms folded loosely, eyes moving from one speaker to the next. She looked calm, but the stillness around her was the kind that meant decisions were being made. Elijah had seen that look before in different places. In military briefings years ago. In hospital waiting rooms when doctors had not returned yet. In moments when people realized time was running out. He should have walked away. Instead, he heard himself speak before the thought had time to stop him. "That word does not mean flexibility," Elijah said quietly from the doorway. The room froze. 14 interpreters turned their heads, almost in perfect unison. A junior executive blinked as though he had not understood what he had just heard. Elijah stood there with one hand on the janitor card, and the other holding the tied trash bag, looking like exactly what he was. A maintenance worker in a faded uniform, standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. One of the interpreters frowned. "Excuse me," she said sharply. Elijah hesitated for half a second. Not because he doubted the translation. Because he knew what it looked like. A janitor correcting professionals who had spent years studying language and diplomacy. Claire Whitmore slowly turned toward the door. Her eyes settled on Elijah and stayed there longer than anyone expected. "What exactly does it mean then?" she asked. The question hung in the air like a test no one in the room had planned to take. Claire Whitmore did not raise her voice when she spoke, yet every person at the table turned toward the doorway again. The janitor standing there looked as if he had wandered into the wrong room by accident. Faded navy uniform. Work gloves tucked into his belt. One hand resting on the metal handle of a cleaning cart. The other still holding the trash bag he had been about to remove. Elijah Brooks felt 14 pairs of professional eyes measuring him at once. Some curious, some annoyed. One of the interpreters let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like disbelief. "That term," Elijah said carefully, choosing his words the way someone chooses steps on a narrow ledge, "does not mean flexibility in that context. In Swedish legal negotiation language, it means conditional commitment. It suggests cooperation only if certain protections remain in place." The Swedish executive across the table leaned forward slightly. For the first time since the meeting began, his expression shifted from frustration to interest. "Go on," he said. Elijah set the trash bag gently into the cart. The plastic rustled softly in the otherwise silent hallway. He kept his voice steady. The translation earlier turned it into something that sounded like a concession. But the phrase actually protects both parties. It is meant to reassure the other side that cooperation will not remove their safeguards. One interpreter straightened in her chair. "That interpretation is oversimplified," she said quickly. Elijah nodded once without looking defensive. It would be oversimplified if the phrase stood alone. But it does not. The sentence before it uses a Danish loan structure that changes the meaning. Together they form a legal reassurance. The Swedish executive exchanged a glance with the colleague beside him and then said something quietly in his own language. Elijah responded in the same language without hesitation. The tone was respectful, the phrasing precise. A few seconds passed while the two men spoke back and forth in calm, measured sentences. Several people in the room looked toward the interpreters, waiting for them to translate what was happening. None of them moved. When Elijah finished, the Swedish executive leaned back slowly in his chair. The frustration in his face had softened into something closer to relief. "Yes," he said in English, looking toward Claire Whitmore. "That is exactly the nuance we have been trying to explain for the last 20 minutes. A murmur passed quietly around the table. One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses. Another executive leaned closer to the documents in front of him, as if seeing them differently now. Claire Whitmore had not taken her eyes off Elijah since the moment he spoke. She studied him the way a strategist studies an unexpected variable in a carefully planned equation. "How many languages do you speak?" she asked finally. Elijah hesitated. Not because he did not know the answer. Because the answer sounded strange in a room like this. "8 conversationally," he said. One of the interpreters blinked. Another shook his head slightly as though the number did not make sense. Claire did not react with surprise. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "And you are working here as a janitor," she said. It was not a question. Elijah gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." The Swedish executive closed the folder in front of him and leaned forward again. Perhaps, he said with a faint smile, your meeting should continue now. The room remained quiet for another moment. Then Claire Whitmore gestured toward an empty chair beside the conference table. Mr. Brooks, she said evenly, would you mind stepping inside for a moment? For a moment no one moved. The invitation hung in the quiet like something fragile that might disappear if anyone spoke too quickly. Elijah Brooks glanced once at the cleaning cart beside him, then back at the long conference table filled with people in tailored suits and polished shoes. It was the kind of room he usually passed through after everyone else had gone home. Not a place where someone in his position was expected to sit down. Claire Whitmore did not repeat the request. She simply waited, her eyes steady, as if patience itself were another form of authority. Elijah stepped forward slowly and pushed the cart gently against the wall before entering the room. The wheels squeaked once across the marble floor, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. 14 interpreters watched him cross the room. Some curious, some uncomfortable, one or two quietly defensive. Elijah stopped beside the empty chair Claire had indicated. You can sit, she said calmly. Elijah nodded and lowered himself into the chair, careful not to touch the stack of legal documents near the edge of the table. The Swedish executive across from him leaned forward again with renewed interest. Earlier, the man said politely, you mentioned that the phrase carried a conditional meaning connected to the previous sentence. Could you explain that structure again? Elijah folded his hands lightly on the table. When he spoke, his voice remained steady and respectful, but the hesitation from the hallway had disappeared. He explained the grammatical shift that occurred when Danish commercial phrasing blended into Swedish negotiation language. How? A small change in word order altered the tone from concession to mutual protection. As he spoke, he occasionally repeated the phrases in their original languages, each one clear and precise. The room listened in complete silence. A lawyer quietly scribbled notes. One of the interpreters slowly removed her headset, as if realizing she no longer needed it. Claire Whitmore leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Elijah with an expression that was neither surprise nor skepticism, but something more analytical. When Elijah finished, the Swedish executive smiled faintly. Yes, he said. That is exactly the understanding our team intended. The tension that had filled the room earlier seemed to loosen all at once. Papers shifted. Someone exhaled. The conversation resumed, but now the tone had changed. When the Swedish delegation spoke, Elijah translated the nuances carefully, not replacing the professional interpreters, but clarifying when subtle phrases might carry unintended meanings. Each time he spoke, the atmosphere around the table grew more stable. Claire occasionally asked a brief question to confirm a detail, and Elijah answered with the same calm precision. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the final documents were reviewed again. The Swedish executive closed the folder in front of him and extended his hand across the table. Now, he said, I believe we understand one another. Claire Whitmore shook his hand firmly. The agreement had not been signed yet, but the collapse everyone feared earlier was no longer hanging over the room. As the delegation began gathering their papers, Claire remained seated, watching Elijah quietly. Finally she spoke again. Mr. Brooks, she said, her tone thoughtful rather than formal. When you finished your shift today, would you mind stopping by my office for a few minutes? Elijah looked at her for a moment, unsure if he had heard correctly. Claire offered the smallest hint of a smile. I have a feeling, she added calmly. There is more to your story than a janitor cart and a hallway outside my conference room. The conference room slowly emptied as the delegation gathered their documents and assistants escorted them toward the elevators. The tension that had filled the air earlier was gone now, replaced by the quieter sound of shoes on marble floors and the soft closing of leather folders. Elijah Brooks returned to the hallway and picked up the handle of his janitor cart again. The moment inside the meeting room had already begun to feel distant, like something that had happened to someone else. He tied another trash bag, wiped down the edge of the wall near the doorway, and continued moving down the corridor the same way he always did, steady and unnoticed. But the building felt different now. A few employees passing by glanced at him longer than usual. Word traveled quickly in offices like Whitmore Global. People did not always know the details, but they sensed when something unusual had happened. Elijah kept his focus on his work. By the time the afternoon light shifted across the glass walls of the upper floors, His cart was lighter, and the hallway outside the conference rooms was quiet again. At exactly 5:30, he finished wiping the last surface near the reception desk and returned the cleaning supplies to the maintenance closet. The small room smelled faintly of detergent and metal shelves. Elijah washed his hands carefully at the sink, dried them with a paper towel, and looked at his reflection in the small mirror above the faucet. A janitor uniform still looked back at him. Nothing about the fabric or the name patch suggested that he had just helped prevent a negotiation from collapsing upstairs. He hung the towel in the bin, collected his jacket from the locker, and stepped back into the hallway. For a moment, he considered heading straight for the exit. There was a bus that left 3 blocks away at 5:50, and he liked to catch it when he could. It gave him enough time to stop by the grocery store before picking up his daughter. But the memory of Claire Whitmore's request stayed with him. When you finish your shift, stop by my office. Elijah hesitated for only a few seconds before walking toward the elevator that led to the executive floor. The ride upward was quiet. The numbers on the panel changed slowly from 28 to 32. When the doors opened, the atmosphere felt different from the floors where most employees worked. The carpet was thicker, the lighting softer, the hallways quieter. A receptionist looked up from her desk as Elijah approached. For a brief second, confusion crossed her face, then recognition. "You are Mr. Brooks, correct?" she asked politely. Elijah nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She gestured toward a large glass office at the end of the corridor. "Ms. Whitmore is expecting you." Elijah walked the rest of the hallway with the same calm steps he used everywhere else. Through the glass walls, he could see Claire Whitmore standing near the wide window behind her desk, the evening skyline stretching across the horizon behind her. She turned as he entered the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire studied him quietly, the way someone studies a puzzle that has just revealed a missing piece. Finally, she gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Mr. Brooks," she said evenly, "tell me how a man who speaks 8 languages ended up pushing a janitor cart in my building." Elijah Brooks remained standing for a moment after Claire Whitmore gestured toward the chair across from her desk. The office around him was quiet in the kind of way only executive spaces seemed to achieve. The carpet softened every step. The walls were glass, revealing a view of Chicago stretching for miles beyond the river. The late afternoon sun turning the buildings into long reflections of gold and steel. Elijah finally took the seat she offered, resting his hands lightly on his knees the same way he had earlier at the conference table. Claire walked slowly around the side of her desk instead of sitting behind it. It was a small detail, but it shifted the tone of the room from interrogation to conversation. 8 languages, she said calmly, folding her arms loosely. That is not something people usually learn by accident. Elijah gave a small, thoughtful nod. "No, ma'am. Not usually." Claire studied him for a moment longer. Her expression was not suspicious, only curious in the focused way of someone used to solving complex problems. "So where did you learn them?" she asked. Elijah looked briefly toward the window behind her. The skyline outside reminded him how late it was getting. His daughter's school pickup time would be approaching soon, but he answered the question honestly. "Some of it started when I served overseas," he said. "Different assignments meant working with different teams. After a while you learn that language is more than vocabulary. It is tone, culture, the way people build trust." Claire listened without interrupting. Elijah continued. "After I left the service I kept studying. Libraries, language exchanges, community classes when I could afford them. A lot of late nights with textbooks and online recordings." Claire tilted her head slightly. Most people would have used those skills to build a career in translation or international business. Elijah smiled faintly at that. It was not a bitter smile, just the quiet recognition of a path that had changed direction somewhere along the way. "Life moves differently sometimes," he said. Claire walked slowly to the window and looked out at the city below. "That sounds like a polite way of saying something went wrong." Elijah did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, without defensiveness. "After my wife passed away, things changed quickly. My daughter was still very young. I needed steady hours more than I needed a complicated job that kept me traveling. The janitor position here offered predictable shifts and health insurance." Claire turned back toward him. The explanation had not been dramatic. It was simple and practical in the way real life often was. "Your daughter," she said. "How old is she?" 9, Elijah replied. "Her name is Maya." Claire nodded slowly. absorbing that information the way she absorbed everything else. So you chose stability, she said quietly. Elijah met her gaze. Children need stability more than they need impressive stories. For a moment the office was silent except for the distant sound of traffic far below the building. Claire Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar agreements and managed entire corporate divisions. But something about that sentence made her pause. Finally she walked back to the desk and rested her hands lightly on the polished surface. "Mr. Brooks," she said thoughtfully, "today you prevented a very important deal from collapsing." Elijah shook his head gently. "I only corrected a misunderstanding." Claire allowed herself the faintest smile. Sometimes correcting a misunderstanding is exactly what saves everything. She looked at him for another moment before continuing. "Tell me something honestly. If circumstances were different, would you still choose to work behind a janitor cart?" Elijah considered the question carefully. "If my daughter is safe and learning to believe in herself," he said, "I can push any cart in the world." Claire Whitmore studied him again, but this time the curiosity in her eyes carried a new layer of respect. Claire Whitmore did not respond immediately after Elijah finished speaking. She remained standing behind her desk, fingers resting lightly against the polished wood, her eyes fixed on him with a quiet intensity that suggested she was recalculating something in her mind. Outside the glass wall of her office, the evening sky had begun to dim, the last light reflecting across the river in long strips of orange and silver. Inside the room, the silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate rather than awkward. Finally, Claire spoke. "Most people who sit in that chair across from me," she said calmly, "are trying very hard to prove how valuable they are." Elijah listened without moving. Claire continued. "You did the opposite. You corrected a problem, then you went back to cleaning the hallway. In this office," she said, "you are worried about catching a bus." Elijah met her gaze calmly. "My daughter will be waiting." For a brief moment Claire Whitmore looked down at the floor, the faintest trace of reflection crossing her face. When she looked up again her expression had softened slightly. "Mr. Brooks," she said thoughtfully, "you may be the first person in this building who understands priorities better than our executive board." Elijah did not answer. He simply waited. Claire walked back to her chair and finally sat down behind the desk, folding her hands together. "Here is what I am thinking," she said. "But before I say anything further, I want to understand one thing clearly. If I offered you a different role here, something that used your knowledge instead of ignoring it, would you even consider it?" Elijah hesitated for the first time since entering the office, not out of fear, but because the question carried more weight than the others. "I would consider anything," he said slowly, "as long as it does not take me away from being a father." Claire Whitmore leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful smile appearing again. "That," she said quietly, "might be exactly why you are the kind of person this company needs." Claire Whitmore remained seated behind her desk, her fingers lightly interlocked as she studied Elijah Brooks with the quiet focus of someone who had spent years making decisions that affected thousands of employees. The evening light had faded almost completely now, leaving the skyline beyond the glass walls glowing with scattered office lights and the steady movement of traffic far below. Elijah glanced once toward the clock on the wall near the doorway. Claire noticed the movement immediately. "You are thinking about that bus again," she said. Elijah nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am. My daughter finishes her program at 6:30. Claire considered that for a moment, then reached for the phone on her desk and pressed a single button. "Angela," she said calmly when the line connected, "please ask the driver to bring the car around in about 5 minutes." Elijah raised his eyebrows slightly. Claire returned the receiver to its cradle and looked back at him. "You will not need the bus today," she said simply. Elijah shifted slightly in the chair, uncertain how to respond. "That is not necessary," he said politely. Claire waved a small hand as though dismissing the objection. "I insist. Anyone who saves a negotiation worth several $100 million has earned a ride across town." Elijah allowed himself a faint smile at that, but did not argue further. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair again, returning to the earlier conversation. "You said something a few minutes ago that stayed with me," she continued. "You said you would consider another role as long as it did not take you away from being a father." Elijah nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Claire tapped her finger lightly against the desk once, thinking. "Whitmore Global negotiates contracts in more than 30 countries every year. We rely on consultants, translators, cultural advisors, and negotiation specialists. Yet today, the most effective interpretation in that room came from someone pushing a janitor cart down the hallway. Elijah remained quiet. Claire continued, her tone calm but deliberate. I am not suggesting that tomorrow you suddenly become a senior executive. Titles do not appear overnight, and neither does trust inside a corporation this size. But talent that reveals itself the way yours did today deserves to be placed somewhere it can actually help people. Elijah listened carefully, the same steady focus he had shown throughout the entire afternoon. Claire leaned forward slightly. What I am proposing is something simple to begin with. A flexible consulting position within our international relations team. Part-time. You would still keep a schedule that allows you to care for your daughter. But when negotiations require cultural or linguistic insight, you would be part of the team rather than standing outside the room. Elijah took a slow breath as the idea settled in. It was not a dramatic offer filled with promises of instant promotion. It was something quieter and more practical. Claire noticed the thoughtful pause and added gently, you would receive proper compensation for the work, of course. Elijah finally spoke. I would need to make sure the hours truly allow me to pick up my daughter every afternoon. Claire smiled slightly. Mr. Brooks, I am offering you the position specifically because you understand priorities. Adjusting a schedule will be the easiest part of this conversation. At that moment, a soft knock sounded at the office door. The receptionist stepped in politely. Ms. Whitmore, the car is ready. Claire nodded and looked back toward Elijah. It seems you have somewhere important to be. Elijah stood slowly from the chair. For a moment he looked around the office again, the skyline, the quiet room, the woman across from him who had just changed the direction of his career with a calm conversation instead of a dramatic speech. Thank you, he said simply. Claire Whitmore rose as well and extended her hand. Mr. Brooks, she replied. Sometimes the right voice is already in the building. People just need to notice it. The elevator doors closed softly behind Elijah Brooks as he stepped into the quiet lobby of Whitmore Global. Outside the glass entrance, the city had fully transitioned into evening, the sidewalks glowing under streetlights while cars moved steadily through the downtown traffic. A black sedan waited at the curb, its headlights reflecting across the polished pavement. The driver stepped out as Elijah approached and opened the rear door with a polite nod. Elijah hesitated for just a moment before getting inside. The car pulled away from the building smoothly, merging into the evening flow of Chicago streets. For the first time since that morning, the day finally began to settle in his mind. Just a few hours earlier, he had been replacing trash liners outside a conference room, listening to a conversation that was not meant for him. Now he was riding across the city after being offered a role inside the very company whose hallways he cleaned every night. Yet the change did not feel dramatic or unreal. It felt quiet, almost practical, the same way most real turning points in life arrived. The car stopped 20 minutes later in front of a modest brick building near a small neighborhood school. Elijah thanked the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The after-school program lights were still on inside the building, and a group of children could be seen through the windows finishing their homework at a long table. When Elijah pushed the door open, a young staff member at the front desk smiled. Evening, Mr. Brooks. Maya is in the back finishing a science worksheet. Elijah nodded gratefully and walked down the hallway. Maya Brooks looked up the moment she heard the door open. Her face brightened instantly. Dad, she said, gathering her backpack and running over. Elijah knelt slightly and hugged her, the kind of quiet hug that made the rest of the day fall back into perspective. How was school? He asked. We started a project about different countries, Maya said excitedly as they walked toward the door. Did you know some people speak 5 languages? Elijah smiled faintly at that. Some people speak more, he said. Maya tilted her head. Really? Elijah nodded as they stepped out into the cool evening air. Sometimes the world is bigger than it looks at first. They walked together toward the corner where the bus usually stopped, but tonight Elijah paused and pointed to the sedan waiting nearby. Maya looked surprised. Are we riding in that? Elijah chuckled softly. Just for tonight. As they climbed into the back seat, Maya leaned against him, still talking about her school project and the countries she wanted to learn about. Elijah listened quietly, watching the city lights pass by the window. Somewhere across town, Claire Whitmore was likely finishing reports about the negotiation that had nearly failed earlier that afternoon. Tomorrow, the details of contracts and corporate planning would begin again. But inside the car, None of that mattered yet. Maya continued explaining how she wanted to learn Spanish and maybe French one day. Elijah smiled and rested his arm gently around her shoulders. "We can start tonight," he said. Outside the window, the Chicago skyline stretched across the horizon, bright and endless. But inside the quiet car, a father was already teaching his daughter that the world could open in ways no one expected, sometimes because the right voice finally chose to speak.